having just an Israel Day parade reduces the entirety of New York Jewish identity to connection to one country, which is a part of many people or most of New York Jews' identities, but it's not the entirety of it. We have lots of identities. And it means that also, because this parade is led by a delegation that's organized by the consulate that comes from the Israeli government, it means that being in this parade is basically forces you, it's essentially a litmus test forces you to march behind the current Israeli government, which seems like you're agreeing with their particular positions. You're celebrating this country that is, that has a government that has been moving farther and farther into illiberal democracy and fascism and endless occupation and endless war. So it seems like that's what you're celebrating.
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. My guest today, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, an organization that trains and mobilizes more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors and their communities to bring a moral voice to protecting and advancing human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. She's the author of Where Justice Dwells, a hands-on guide to doing social justice in your Jewish community, and There Shall Be No Needy, Pursuing Social Justice Through Jewish Law and Tradition. Welcome, Rabbi Jill.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. I initially started this podcast to challenge the myths used to justify war, and it has expanded to explore other questions and to platform interesting people doing meaningful work and also stand-up comedians along the way. What do you think is a myth that needs challenging right now?
Well, about war, I think a major myth is that this war is going to provide security for Israel and Israelis. There's quite reasonably, Israelis are concerned about Iran and its proxies and Hezbollah and the Houthis and everybody who has been, and Hamas, of course. And so there's a common perception that the response to that has to be war, and that continuing this war in Lebanon and in Iran is going to somehow protect particularly the Israelis who are in the north, who have been on the front lines for, decades, but really for the last 3 years. And I think something that we've learned over the last few years of war is that war does not provide protection. It generally means that there's going to be more deaths on both sides. And it means also that you have people who are growing up in this situation where the answer to every diplomatic challenge is war, and then buy into that. And, I think we've seen from Israel's end, we had, Israel saying that they're going to eliminate Hamas and eliminate Hezbollah in these moments when they actually had weakened both those organizations. And of course, we see that they come roaring back, that killing a top leader, that having some kind of a military victory over one of these groups does not mean that it goes away. It actually encourages that group often to even take a moment and to rebuild their power. And of course, young people who are growing up in a situation where Israel is bombing them are going to themselves probably look for those kinds of organizations to join. And so this should be obvious. I feel like it should be obvious. I think about, there's been in my lifetime, this is now the third war with Lebanon. The first one I don't really remember, but it was in my lifetime. And they've all ended badly, but somehow we just keep doing it again.
Yes, and something that's often missing from the discourse is Hezbollah only formed after the first Lebanon war. It didn't exist beforehand, so that's quite literally how war makes things worse and plants the seeds for the other war. Another myth that you've been doing a great job challenging in our city, which listeners may not be able to hear in the background, is challenging bigotry towards our mayor, towards Mayor Zohran Mamdani. He recently was at the Truah gala, and you wrote an important op-ed about how Jewish groups should work with him. Tell me about your work with the mayor.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, first of all, that as the now mayor was rising in the polls, I was nervous about the fact that he came up through pro-Palestine and often anti-Israel activism, that was really core to him. I had engaged with him previously when he was in assembly around the non our dime bill, and which I agreed with some of the goals of it, but also had concerns about the way that it was written. And so I think I think anybody who knows me knows that he wasn't my first choice in the primary. But once it became clear that he was the Democratic nominee, it was important for me to meet with him, which I did just a few days after the primary last June. And what I learned is from that meeting and further conversations, both with him and with his staff, are that, yes, the pro-Palestine politics are very key to his upbringing and to his activism, and he does feel more comfortable in farther left spaces, and also that he is willing to listen. And I've seen this really in real time as he's learned about the Jewish experience with anti-Semitism, met Israelis, met Jews who care about Israel, learned about what Israel means to American Jews, that we've seen his language changing. We've seen him talk about the horrors of the Second Intifada, which I'll say I was living in Israel that year, and it was terrifying. And I lost friends in suicide bombing attacks, not that particular year that I was there, but in a previous year. And and he's somebody who's able to hear that and reflect back on those horrors. We saw his language shifting around globalize the Intifada from a first very clumsy attempt to explain what the word Intifada means in a kind of very academic way to eventually saying, I've heard from Jews that this elicits fear that this kind of violence and terror is going to come to our shores. And so therefore, I think he said I would discourage the use of that term. I don't want to misquote, but I think that was the language that he used. And we've seen also the evolution of the responses to the various protests outside of either Nefesh B'Nefesh events or real estate events at synagogues, Nefesh B'Nefesh being a group that encourages Jews to move to Israel. They, as far as I can tell, don't really care if you move inside of Israel or the settlements. And then the real estate events, which are selling inside and outside of the international boundaries of Israel, that we've seen that he's really shifted his language around that. And so for me, that is a lesson in the importance of engaging, that when somebody is willing to engage and trying to broaden their perspective, that it means that the Jewish community should engage with him. And unfortunately, much of the mainstream Jewish community has decided instead to declare war on him. So you saw at the Wall Street dinner earlier this year, Mark Rowan, who's the chair of the board of UJA Federation in New York, got up and he said, Donald Trump is not our enemy. Angela Bookdahl naming the rabbi of one of or maybe the largest synagogue in Manhattan, one of the most prominent rabbis in Manhattan, is not our enemy. I think he said that because some people on the right were angry that Rabbi Bookdahl didn't endorse in the election, as rabbis shouldn't endorse any candidates. But he said, Donald Trump isn't our enemy. Angela Bookdahl isn't our enemy. He named a bunch of other people. And he said, Zohran Mamdani is our enemy, which is a pretty extraordinary statement for the chair of one of, if not the largest social service agencies in New York to make. I don't even know how many city contracts UJ has, but it's, many, many. And most of their work is extraordinary work, feeding people, providing social services, providing services for people with mental health crisis, like for Jews and non-Jews. It's really unbelievable, extraordinary work that the Jewish community puts millions and millions of dollars into. And it was actually quite shocking that the chair of the board of that organization would get up and say the mayor of New York is the enemy of the Jewish people. And which is very different than saying, we have disagreements with him. We're mad at him about this. We condemn this language he used to say that he is just straight up the enemy, as opposed to Donald Trump, who is destroying the entire social service system that Federation has been both advocating for and also funding for many years. Like Trump's policies have a direct impact on Federation, so many Jews in New York are immigrants, and our neighbors are immigrants, and obviously policies, ICE practices threaten anybody who wasn't born in this country, as well as many people who were. So, all to say, I don't think that that is a very helpful response from New York Jews. I think that our response should be to work with the mayor of New York. I also think that there's no separate Shabbos for Jews. Like, there's no way of constructing a city in which Jews are safe and other people are not safe. It's either all minority communities or no minority communities. And so we also have to partner with other minority communities. But we've seen this stance from the mainstream of saying we're boycotting the mayor. We're not, he's the enemy. We're not speaking to him. And, I was at a dinner of a kind of mainstream event a few months ago, and somebody got up, and one of the speakers got up on stage and said former Mayor Adams was there, and somebody acknowledged him and then said, but of course the current mayor wouldn't come. And I asked one of the organizers of the event, hey, did you invite him? And they hadn't invited him. And maybe he would have come, maybe he wouldn't have come. I don't know. I can't say. I'm not his scheduler, but somebody isn't going to come if you don't invite them. They don't even have the chance to come. So Truah did invite the mayor to come and offer words of welcome at our gala. We also hosted Mark Levine, who is a longtime friend of Truah and is the highest level Jewish elected official in New York City. He's a controller and has been very clear about his Zionism, and has also been involved in democracy protests, pro-democracy protests against the Israeli government, and hostage protests. So he was there, as well as Brad Hoylman-Siegel, who is the borough president. So just city elected officials. I'll say that Congress was in session, which is why there weren't there weren't members of Congress there. They were in DC, hopefully.
Yeah.
And he got up and he spoke really beautifully about Truah's work, and very knowledgeably about Truah's work. He spoke about, spoke about the ways that I've been involved in trying to help his administration to navigate New York City. He spoke really beautifully about our honorees, who include an Israeli American activist, Gili Getz, who has been very involved in peace building for his whole life. And he spoke beautifully about Rabbi Orli Matlow, who's the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun, which was our host for the evening and is retiring. So he just spoke really beautifully about our work and the work of the honorees and others who are involved with us. And for me, that was a win for the Jewish community. It meant that the mayor is getting up at an event of an organization that is not a far-left anti-Zionist organization. It's maybe outside of where people expect to see him, and he's speaking really beautifully about the work of that organization, about the work of an Israeli-American activist. And that is something that and there were many people in the room who are leaders of major American Jewish organizations. And it was really important, first of all, that he could see the coalition that Truah's pulled together, that he was in a room of Jews that maybe is different from other rooms that he's in, and he sees the power of this organization. It's important for people to hear directly from him what he's saying, because so much of what we hear is filtered through the people who are angry at him and yelling at him and representing what he's saying in different ways, or using, the favorite strategy is I think in geometry, it's the transitive property, right? I did take ninth grade geometry a very long time ago, but I think that's right. It's like he's connected to this other person who's connected to this other person who said this thing that's really offensive and anti-Semitic. So it was important for people to hear that from him, to hear that he is tripling the budget of the hate crimes office in order to address hate crimes against Jews and other people in New York City who are likely to be victims of hate crimes. Just in the last week or so, I know there were incidents against Jews, against a queer person, I think in not far memory, I can't remember exactly when, against a couple of Muslim men. Like, there's just, unfortunately, it's a big city. There's a lot of different people. There's been a lot of anti-Asian hate crimes. Jews are the the hate crime data shows that most of the hate crimes that are reported are against Jews. I think I'm getting that right. So that obviously needs to be addressed, and also hate crimes against anybody who's being assaulted or harassed for any reason, for any identity that they hold. So it's really important that people hear that directly from him. Um, and most of the people who we heard from both that night and afterwards were really glad that he came to a Truah event. They understood that it was a big deal for him to be there. They were grateful. They were really grateful for what he said about Truah, and for his commitment to, what he said about fighting hate crimes and fighting anti-Semitism. And there were a few people who were not at the event, and who have generally taken the approach of not engaging with Mamdani, but just declaring him to be the enemy, who were angry and think that that means that Truah is somehow outside of the, uh, outside of the tent now. But I think that drawing those very hard boundaries, saying that not only can you not talk to anti-Zionists, you can't talk to anybody who talks to anti-Zionists. Like, I don't think that serves the Jewish community well. I think that actually makes us less safe in the long run. I think right now we have a choice of either creating our own little fortress with very high walls and hiding behind it, and trying to somehow protect ourselves or some part of our community, which, maybe could work for a little while, but I don't think in the long run, or trying to actually have relationships with other communities around New York and with the mayor of New York and with his administration, and trying to work with him to make the city safer for Jews and for everybody. And so that's the direction that I choose. That's obviously not the direction that everybody has chosen.
Thank you. And the transitive property is interesting, at risk of mixing metaphors, like people in glass houses should not throw stones, because what percentage of people marched with Bezalel Smotrich a few weeks ago? So that's my way of segueing to, you recently published a piece called New York Needs a Jewish Parade, Not an Israel Parade. So tell us about your vision for what a parade that accurately reflects our values would look like, and whether or not Bezalel Smotrich of starving Palestinians is moral and they don't even exist as a people fame would be part of the festivities.
Yeah, I had so much fun writing this piece, in part because I got to call all of my friends who are from different parts of the Jewish world, right? They're Bukharan and Persian and Greek and Ashkenazi. And well, I'm also Ashkenazi, so I didn't have to make too many phone calls on that. And just say to them, like, what's your favorite food from your tradition? What's your favorite music? What's your favorite other cultural uh, expression? And it was really amazing to have those conversations. And so this parade, so let's talk about the problem with the Israel parade. So the Israel parade in New York has been around since 1964. It started as just a very small parade to support this really kind of fledgling state. And it makes sense that Jews, particularly in the early years of Israel, were very worried about its continual existence and wanted to have a presence to celebrate and to support Israel. And at that time also there was general support in the United States for Israel, certainly more than there is now. And so that makes sense, and why it existed then. And also, as New York goes, um, there's so many parades. Like, I was having dinner with an Israeli friend the other day, and he was trying to understand. He said, like, why do you even need a parade? And I said, look, welcome to New York. Yesterday was a Puerto Rican Day parade. There's the Dominican parade. There's St. Patrick's, which is Irish, right? There's Three Kings. Like, there's everybody. Well, not everybody gets a parade, because I don't even know how many ethnic groups. There's like 800 languages spoken in New York. So I don't know how many ethnic groups that actually translates to. So there aren't enough days in the year, certainly weekends in the year, for everyone to get a parade, but there's a lot of parades. So the Jews get one parade, right? We're not going to get two parades. The Jews are going to get one parade down Fifth Avenue. And the parade that the Jews have decided upon is the Israel parade, which in some parallel world makes sense, because all the other parades I mentioned, other than like Three Kings, like the procession, which is a religious procession, not exactly a parade in the normal sense, or maybe the Pride Parade, they're all tied to countries, because that's usually how people are tied together. Like my neighborhood in New York, it's mostly Dominican. So that's how people are connected to each other, and that's what the parade is. But Jews don't really fit into that box because Jews are an ethnicity and a people and a religion and have a homeland and are connected to the land of Israel and also the state of Israel, but Jews aren't Israelis per se, though of course there are also tens of thousands of Israeli Jews in New York. So all to say that having just an Israel Day parade reduces the entirety of New York Jewish identity to connection to one country, which is a part of many people or most of New York Jews' identities, but it's not the entirety of it. We have lots of identities. And it means that also because this parade is led by a delegation that's organized by the consulate that comes from the Israeli government, it means that being in this parade is basically forces you. It's essentially a litmus test of forces you to march behind the current Israeli government, which seems like you're agreeing with their particular positions. You're celebrating this country that is that has a government that has been moving farther and farther into illiberal democracy and fascism and endless occupation and endless war. So it seems like that's what you're celebrating. Now, most of the people who come to the parade are day school children. And because, those are the most of the groups, and the kids get bussed in, and in some cases they're required or basically required to be there. And the 8-year-olds waving an Israeli flag are not thinking about Bezalel Smotrich or Yitzhak, you know, Wasserlauf or any of these people. They're thinking, I love Israel. It's so cool to be in a parade. I'm with my friends. I just don't want to cast aspersions on these 8-year-olds. Like when people say everybody who marched in the parade was supporting the Israeli government. No, most of the people marched in the parade are small children or even larger children, but they're not marching in it because of their political views, but they're forced into a situation, or their families are forced into a situation where they are walking behind the Israeli delegation, and it seems like they're supporting the government. And I'll say about Smotrich, I think it's possible that the mainstream, UJA and JCRC, which organize the parade, say they didn't know he was coming. I think that's possible. I don't know, of course. He was not announced as coming. But some of the other folks who were there, Kellner and Eliyahu and Wasserlauf and Ohana, they were announced beforehand. And some of them are, they're members of the coalition, including members of Smotrich's party, members of um, Ben Gvir's party. There are people who have made horrendous statements, including calling for killing of babies, like just really horrendous statements. And so none of them should be people who the Jewish community is welcome. So I'll say about my parade first, where first of all, I make all the rules, so it's going to be really great. And maybe I'll bring in an advisory committee to make the rules. But so that's how I would design it. So it's the New York Jewish Parade, which means that you have everything from different bands that are singing in Ladino and in Yiddish and Bukharan and many other Jewish languages. They're playing all sorts of other instruments. I learned a friend who is Ethiopian, Israeli, now American, suggested that I put in the krar, which is a cool Ethiopian instrument. I had to look it up. Stringed instrument. So there would be that, krar would be in there, and, all sorts of instruments. There would be, the Jewish Museum can come and they can have big blow-ups of their different exhibits, like a paper mache of, I said, Modigliani or Chagall. Right now their exhibit is Paul Klee, who I think wasn't even Jewish, but whatever. They'll have a museum exhibit. There can be an exhibit of the first Spanish-Portuguese, like a model of the first Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Manhattan that could be, floating on a float. People can be in their traditional Jewish ethnic costumes, dancing. Like there can be everything, every expression of Judaism. And that includes Israel. Israel is not out of this parade. I think something like 37,000 New Yorkers were born in Israel, and many more also have Israeli citizenship. And so there will be Israeli flags, and the day school kids can still come with their Israeli flags, and there can be Israeli dancing and Israeli music and Hebrew. And like Israel is not shut out of the parade because it's also part of New York Jewish identity. It's just not the only thing. So in terms of can Smotrich and them come? So I would, oh, and sorry, I want to say one more thing, which is that politics is also part of it. Like we don't just erase politics. Now there's this move to kind of say, we just want Jewish joy. We don't want any politics. But politics has always been part of Judaism, like basically, since the Torah, since the very beginning. And so that means that progressive groups left-wing groups like JFREJ, like JVP, like If Not Now, they can have floats, and their floats can have language about ICE, right? It can say abolish ICE. It can have language about Israel, right? It can say stop the war. It can say, like it's end the occupation, right? We can have that kind of language. We can have more right-wing Jewish groups that have different language. I suggested that there be a committee that figures out where each of the groups goes, because so they're not, you don't want to put the left-wing groups and the right-wing groups right up against each other. So it years ago, when I was in Chicago for my first job at a rabbinical school at Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, it was before most Jewish groups would march in the Pride Parade. So JCUA had a contingent where I worked with like the LGBTQ synagogue in Chicago. And so I was there with all of them, and they'd put us right behind the Jagermeister float, like the beer.
Oh,
And their
l'chaim.
there's yes, but their logo is a big cross.
Oi.
So it was like the cross and then the Jews. So you just want somebody who's going to make sure that doesn't happen. So you just keep the like left-wing groups away from the right-wing groups, but that's fine because it's a big parade. And then, there could be a big celebration in Central Park, and you could have cooking demonstrations and different food and activities, and people of all genders can put on tefillin. Like it'll be awesome. It'll be so much fun, so much more fun than the Israel parade, which honestly is kind of boring. With all due respect to 8-year-old kids and their Israeli flags. In terms of Smotrich, so this is a New York Jewish parade. So I think that the consul general should be invited to march. I think the Israeli consulate can have a delegation of people who work in the consulate, but the Israeli government doesn't get to come. They don't send a delegation because they're not New York Jews. They're Israeli Jews. And that solves the problem of which members of the government would be allowed to come.
I love that. I was thinking now there should be a stand-up comedian float. Maybe we get
Yeah, 100%. Well, maybe
the
this
Writers Guild.
It would be hard to hear comedy during the parade,
Yes.
but at the festival afterwards, there can be a stage and there'll be different performances. So there could be, stand-up comedians can perform there.
I love it. I think, the closest we might get this year is Bezrat Hashem, a Knicks championship parade.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. You talk about the rich diversity of the Jewish experience, and I feel like what we're getting now from the media is saying that the modern state of Israel is integral to what it means to be Jewish. So as a rabbi, what was Jewish life before 1948, or even before Alt Neuland was published in 1902? Like, what can Jewish life be without Likud looming over us?
Okay, so I want to be clear that I want the state of Israel to continue to exist. I do not want Likud to be looming over us. So I just want, yes. So, Jewish life, obviously that is there's a very long story of Jewish life. Jews had different statuses in different places they lived. In the best cases, were able to basically be ignored or even get protection and live without too much disturbance. Obviously, the worst cases were really bad and included expulsions and murders. And in between that, there's a lot of, differing rights and differing political statuses. So, whether Jews had could vote, could own land, what restrictions there were around worship, both public and private worship, like those really varied by not only by the empire, like even thinking before cities, before nation states, but even like maybe by the city or by the right, by the little area. So there were a whole variety of um, realities that govern Jews' lives, and sometimes more or less better, and sometimes truly terrible, and often most of the time somewhere in the middle. And that includes, I want to say that Jews have always lived in the land of Israel, before the state of Israel under the British Empire, before that for a long time under the Ottoman Empire, before that under various other Byzantine, right, various other empires, obviously going way back under Jewish sovereignty. And so there was always a Jewish community, a longstanding Jewish community that for much of history was living under the Ottoman Empire as a minority, also with different statuses. Sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse, depending on particular laws in the Ottoman Empire. So I don't want to either say everything was amazing or everything was terrible. Like it was a really big mix, which is, the subject of like several thousand history books.
Mhm.
Um, so, but at this point, there are a lot of factors that led to Zionism and to the creation of the state of Israel. It's impossible to talk about it without talking about the context of the 19th and early 20th century, when the age of empire, when empires were falling and nation states were emerging. And it's very natural that as each nation, each group of people is creating a nation state, which involves um, often some kind of myth building, right? To say like this group of people is united as a nation, and now we're going to formulate it into a nation state. But it's natural that Jews were also saying, okay, so we're going to have a German nation state and a Polish nation state and a Latvian nation state, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, where do the Jews go? And knowing that Jews were not, like, if you were a Jew living in Poland, you weren't Polish, you were Jewish, right? It's an ethnicity as a race. It wasn't like we think about citizenship now. You get American citizenship, right? You take your oath, and now you're 100% American, even if you were born somewhere else, because Americans just don't think about nationality and ethnicity in the same way that it was thought about during times of empire and the emergence of nation states, where empires would deal with a group of people as a group, like they're dealing with a representative of the Jews or the representative of this minority or that minority, or this, ethnic, national, etc. group. So that's one of the factors. So we just have to think about Jews like in that context, thinking about, okay, well, where do we fit in now that the world is coalescing into a collection of nation states? And the other factor that's important to understand is that following the French Revolution in Western Europe, Jews started to be emancipated, which again meant different things at different places. It wasn't like everybody was in the same situation, but basically Jews were getting more political rights, maybe could own land in places they weren't previously able to own land, or could be in professions they weren't able to be in, or could vote, more civil and religious rights, again, really depended on the particular place. And there was the promise of the Enlightenment that, equality, et cetera, and also a move away from, let's say, Christian-based anti-Semitism, which, sees Jews are the ones who didn't accept Jesus Christ and basically shouldn't be and shouldn't be here at all. And, is debated in different ways in different times about how to deal with Jews. So the Enlightenment promised equality for Jews, or at least acceptance, and it just didn't happen, right? That promise didn't happen. And so Jews were debating, okay, well, where do we find safety? Do we want to try to find safety in the places where we are, maybe through political and cultural autonomy, right? That's the position when you think about the Bund, like they supported political, cultural, Jewish autonomy. I think that's one of the myths about them, is that they weren't nationalists, but they were. They wanted Jews to have their autonomy in the places where Jews were living. Um, and Zionism, which also has meant all sorts of different things, but um, basically, for the most part, with a few exceptions, involved a Jewish return to our homeland in the land of Israel. But also, there were a lot of debates about, well, what does that mean? Does that mean becoming loyal citizens of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire? during when it was under Ottoman rule? Does it mean a nation state? Does it mean a binational state? There is a version of Zionism that maybe wouldn't have led to a state, but would have led to some other formation. But really, after the Holocaust, a lot of these debates came to a halt because, um, Jews obviously had been massacred, and we saw that most countries around the world were not willing to take in either refugees from Nazi Germany immediately before, during the war, or even after the war. Most countries were not that interested in accepting these refugees. And Jews who tried to go home, there were pogroms in Poland after the war. It wasn't like you could just go home and pretend nothing had happened. I mean, God forbid, also people's families were slaughtered. But it wasn't like the Poles wanted their Jews back. They absolutely did not. And so that's, so that really sped up the establishment of the state of Israel. And at this point, so all that is history. At this point, there's a state. It's a state with close to 10 million people who are citizens. About 80% are Jewish, about the other 20% are Palestinian citizens. And it's a state that also has jurisdiction over about 5 million Palestinians who are not citizens of any country and are living in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the areas that were captured in 1967 during the Six-Day War. And so I believe that Israel should continue to exist as a state. I think first we have to deal with Israel as a state, the way we deal with the United States or Canada or any other state that has an often bloody and unjust history, but is a state with people living in it who have no other passport, who don't have another language, who are not going to all get up and leave and go somewhere else. And that means calling out human rights abuses, including, of course, the occupation, including war crimes committed during any of the wars of the last few years or at any moment. But I believe that Israel should continue to exist as a state. And I believe that there should also be a Palestinian state side by side with Israel. The negotiators from both sides can figure out the details. There's many maps that are still on the table. They all look more or less the same. They're all possible still. They're the most possible solution. They're also, I would say, the least unpopular solution. When you poll both Israelis and Palestinians and you ask them, do you want one state? Do you want two states? Do you want this formation? Nobody wants anything. So every solution is unpopular, but the least unpopular is two states, both among Palestinians and among Israelis. And so I believe that Israel should exist without an occupation, with a Palestinian state next to it, with a Palestinian and a Palestinian minority that has equal rights within it. I would hope that the state of Palestine will also have a Jewish minority with equal rights inside of it. They're going to have to figure that out. And I hope that Likud won't be in power. I mean, Netanyahu's rule, and particularly this coalition, but really he's all of his years of rule and the right wing dominance in the state have led to a state that is basically driven by the settler agenda, where everything else, all economic issues, social issues, education, everything is less important than the expansion of territory, driving Palestinians out of their land, expanding occupation, expanding settlements. And that is bad. Certainly it's horrific for Palestinians who are being occupied and being driven from their homes. And it's also bad for Israelis who just want to go to school and have jobs and live their lives and be in peace with their neighbors and be living in a normal country. So that's really my hope for Israel. Certainly it starts with getting rid of Netanyahu, but there's a lot more work that has to happen.
Yes, I think about it all the time. I do have family there. My cousin's son is 6 years old, learning to play the violin, and he should be able to just play the violin without being handed a rifle at 18 to monitor settlements. I think about it a lot. The status quo is not helpful to Israelis either. How does being a rabbi inform your human rights work, and how does your human rights work inform your rabbinic work?
Yeah, well, when I think about human rights, sometimes people will hear the critique, or rabbis will hear the criticism, like, Rabbi, just talk about Judaism, don't talk about politics. And like, in order to do that, you would have to basically like get rid of the Torah and most of Jewish law and most of Jewish writing. Because when you open, the Torah, like chapter 1, the very first thing we learn about humanity is that human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And that is not just a nice idea, it's actually concretized into laws and practices about how human beings are supposed to treat each other, and about responsibilities both toward ourselves and toward other people, that human beings can expect to be treated in a way that is appropriate for someone who's created in the image of God, but also we have responsibilities to treat other people in that way. And the Torah goes on and gives um, a lot of instructions about how to create a just society. It's really instructive that after we receive Torah um, at Mount Sinai, some of the very first commandments that are specified have to do with how you treat workers, what to do when there's some kind of an altercation between two people, setting up systems of judgment. That's actually, setting up courts is considered to be one of the laws that was given to Noah, one of the seven Noahide laws that um, and that you need to have just courts. And that is because what God is saying to us is, look, it's not enough for you to have a relationship with me. Like, I don't just want sacrifices. This is not just about ritual. It's about a whole integrated community. It's important that when you look at the traditional division of Jewish laws, like generally into 4 categories, and one of those is choshen mishpat, which is all of the civil laws, because civil law, everything from how do you treat workers to just how do you, if you're renting out an apartment or a house, what's the relationship between landlords and tenants, to how should a court of law work, to what does happen if somebody assaults somebody else or somebody steals somebody else's property, or just, basic Jewish life. Like, that is also Jewish law. Jewish law isn't just about what you can eat and what you can't eat. And so for me as a rabbi, being a rabbi means teaching all of that law and trying to live out that law. And for me, Truah, which, as you said, represents more than 2,300 rabbis across the US and Canada, is about supporting rabbis and being able to live out those obligations in their home communities and nationally, and also as it in reference to Israel and Palestine. And so that is really integral for me and what it means to be a Jew and to be a rabbi. And I also think that, justice work, human rights work is hard, and we also need ritual. So what I don't want to say is, oh, well, forget all of that ritual stuff. We just need to be out there in the streets doing human rights work. I mean, I'm a conservative rabbi. I have a very traditional practice. And for example, when I think about Shabbat, every Friday evening before sunset, I'm turning off my phone, I'm turning off my computer. I'm not on it until after dark on Saturday night. And for me, that's because Shabbat is a time to enjoy the world as it is, not try to change it, not try to create anything, not destroy anything. And also there's an idea that Shabbat is also Me'ein Olam Haba. It's like a glimpse of the world to come. And it's a moment that you can actually see what might be possible and get out of your day-to-day I'm just trying to change this one thing, or I'm fighting the system, and like say, okay, well, what would it actually look like if the world were different? And it's also a moment of rejuvenation. And it's significant that there's 2 traditional reasons for Shabbat. One is because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So we're emulating God in that way and saying, if even God could say, like, I'm sure God had a lot of ideas about things that could have been created or changed on the 7th day. I'm sure, like, one more day, maybe, I don't know, lots of other things would have happened, but that even God could say, I can take a break and just let it be. And then the other reason stems from the experience in slavery, that slaves have no control over their time. And it's a reminder that we used to be in that situation of slavery where you have to work every single day, and that this is actually something that is affirming the rights of workers, that it's affirming the rights of everybody to be able to take time just for themselves. So for me, that's also a justice practice, and it's also something that sustains the other 6 days of the week. So I think that's something that Judaism for sure can teach to justice work, and also is, for me, it's about living an integrated Judaism where I'm living out the obligations to civil law, to creating a just community, to creating a place where everybody is treated as they should be, as an image of God. And also ritual practice is as much a part of my practice.
Thank you. I love it. And you mentioned the integrated Jewish practice. What are some moments from Truah actions that resonate with you or stay with you the most?
Yeah. So we've done a series of ICE actions over the course of the last few months. We had a major action at the ICE headquarters in DC in February. We had about 150 rabbis. It was a total of 500 or 600 Jews. We think it's the largest ICE action by the Jewish community ever, but including 150 or so rabbis. And it was very much steeped in prayer and ritual, using symbols like the talit, using the shofar. So very much integrating ritual into it and saying, again, that it's not like we have our justice Judaism and our ritual Judaism. They can all be part of one thing. And the other piece is that the times that we've had rabbis arrested for civil disobedience, including a year ago, I was in a minion of rabbis who were arrested protesting outside the Israeli consulate in New York, protesting the for humanitarian aid and food aid to go into Gaza. And just this at the end of April, we had a minion of rabbis arrested outside of the courthouse in New York, where a lot of people, where immigrants are going to their normal hearings and immigration appointments, but ICE has been really brutally detaining people there. So we had a minion of rabbis arrested there. And each of those times and other times when rabbis are being put into um, not handcuffs, but the you call it the zip ties by the
Mm.
police, people on the sides have started to chant, "That's my rabbi." Like, "That's
Wow.
my rabbi." And it's really beautiful and amazing that you have all these people who are saying, "That's who I want as my rabbi." Like, they might not know a particular rabbi. They don't necessarily even know my name, but it's like, "But that's my rabbi. That's who I'm standing with." So it's been incredibly powerful.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And for the last question, do you have a favorite niche Talmud track? You know,
Any tract and the whole Masechet or a text?
or just any niche thing that we might not know about, whether it's mixing fabrics or something hilariously specific that you find entertaining.
Okay, so I'll give you one entertaining that is not about social justice. So I have a very long time Chavrita study partner. We've been studying for, I don't know, more than 10 years. And we kind of like, it's always Talmud, but we try to mix it up. So we just started Beitzah, which is a tractate that starts with the very important question of an egg that is laid on Yom Tov, on Chag, and questions surrounding, can you eat it? Can you use it? How do you know when it was laid? But uh, it's getting into a lot of questions of chicken anatomy and chicken behavior that were previously, that I do not spend a lot of time thinking about. So um, the just on Friday, we learn on Friday mornings. On Friday, we were reading a section that had to do with the question of how you know if an egg was fertilized. And I won't get into why that was important, but basically they pod that a hen will go like the length of like 60 homes in order to find a rooster.
Oh, wow.
And also that a hen will walk across a bridge that's over a river to find a rooster, but will not go across a rope bridge, which seems to be something you would have to like maybe cling on to like make your, to like the monkey bars kind of thing to like make your way across. And so I have been, I really wish that I were an artist so I could actually draw these pictures. I'm sure AI could do it, but I'm not going to ask it to do that. But I've been definitely spending more time thinking about chicken behavior than I otherwise do in my day job.
I
Um,
love it. I didn't realize why did the chicken cross the road was a Talmudic question.
yes, why did the chicken cross the river at least?
Yeah. And thank you so much. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.